We're all here to solve a mystery, which is how is it that these two very passionate, prolific students of American history suddenly have decided to study Leonardo da Vinci. It's not what you'd expect, because Walter, as we all know, is interested in technology and innovation, and his subjects are people like Benjamin Franklin and Albert Einstein. And Ken Burns also has done a biography of Benjamin Franklin, but his heart is usually in the crises and the cultural movements of the country. So none of this tracks to Leonardo da Vinci, who died 100 years before the Mayflower left England. So the mystery is there a connection or not?
Thank you, Alison.
Yeah. So I can speak for myself, and I'm actually really anxious to hear your answer about this too, but I was having dinner with a noted biographer of mostly Americans in Washington, D.C. named Walter Isaacson. I was deep into a film about Benjamin Franklin, and he had given us a good interview for that. And we were talking and had someone else there, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Walter started saying, this is a twofer. You should also do Leonardo. And I said, Walter, I don't do non-American topics. I mean, this is 50 years, and there's only American topics. We may range to Europe and World War II. We may go to Vietnam in the Vietnam War, but these are American subjects and American films. And I was already thinking in my mind for 10 years from now whether I could justify doing Winston Churchill because his mother was American, and that was giving me some protection. Walter would not let go. He was making this argument that here you have the greatest scientist of the 18th century, certainly American scientist of the 18th century. The world would probably say that Benjamin Franklin was that. And he was a great artist in his own right, an artist of words, of humor, and I think probably most importantly of political genius, a real artist. He forges the compromises, both spectacular and tragic, that created the United States. And Walter was making these arguments, and Leonardo is, of course, the greatest scientist of the 15th and early 16th century, and arguably the greatest artist of all time, certainly the greatest artist of his period, certainly the painter of the most famous painting in the world, still to this day, and that he's a person of great other curiosities and ambitions. And so I just kept pushing back, and it was always a delightful meal with Walter wherever we eat, New Orleans or Washington, D.C., or even New York City. But I went out and I called my daughter, Sarah Burns, my oldest daughter of 4, and her husband, David McMahon. We've been collaborating on the Central Park Five and Jackie Robinson and a big series on Muhammad Ali, which we were in the midst of. And they said, how was the dinner with Walter? And I said, it was great, except he kept pushing me on Leonardo. And there was this just nanosecond of a pause, and they said, we can do Leonardo. And I suddenly went, right, we can do Leonardo. What's the deal? You're actually, in any story, you're getting at something that's universal and human, and what could be more important than dealing with probably, arguably, the person of the last millennium. Shakespeare has a good argument. Mozart, Bach have good arguments. But, this guy was the most curious man who ever lived, who understood so much more than just about anybody on earth. And still to this day, we're in the thrall of his revelation. So I blame it all on Walter. But now I want to know, I had not realized that night, or I'd forgotten that you had written a biography of Leonardo. And I knew that's why you were talking about it, that we could just continue to work together, and did. Walter gave a great interview for that film as well. But how did Leonardo get within your American purview?
Well, you put Leonardo and say maybe there's Shakespeare or other stuff. The thing that separates Leonardo and puts him in a category with Ben Franklin, maybe Aristotle, and it's hard to name the others, is the people in history who tried to know everything you could know about every subject that was knowable. And you say he was an artist in terms of both Benjamin Franklin, Leonardo. Musicians, they both invent musical instruments. Right. They both love math and music and science and experiments. And so if you're somebody who tries to see across the humanities to the technology, to the sciences, to the arts. You see certain patterns in nature, which you have very much in your documentary, like even the spirals and swirls, which are all throughout the, thousands of pages of Leonardo's notebooks, where he's doing those swirls, the deluge drawings at the end of his life, trying to get Fibonacci's equation to do the math of them, making it into the curls of the Mona Lisa and the winds. And I remember I went with Kathy, this sounds place dropping, but Windsor Castle Castle has some of Leonardo's drawings. So Kathy helped me talk my way into it by meeting somebody there. And I go to Martin Clayton, who's I think in your thing, and he brings out the deluge drawings. And I say, did Leonardo do that as a work of art or a work of science? And Martin Clayton, in the way, yes, there's me staring at them, not trying to. Oswald will appreciate this the way
I'll
only
zoom in on it for you so you know it's me.
A British. He looked at him and he said, I don't think Leonardo would have made that distinction. And that becomes the theme of what Sarah. And by the way, you said Sarah tries to talk you into it. And what did they do as soon as they decided to do the film?
So Sarah, my oldest daughter, and her husband, David McMahon, decided that in order to do this, they had to move their family with my two oldest grandchildren to Florence, Italy, from the summer of 22 to the summer of 23. That was legitimate, had, do the research, begin the writing, do the shooting, do the interviews with a lot of scholars, French and Italian first, and then radiate. And that's the thing we did, is we wanted to talk to the biographers, the kind of the moat around the castle, and the art historians who could place him. But it was really important for us to see a working Leonardo today. So, Kerry James Marshall, the painter, Guillermo del Toro, the filmmaker, a theater director, an engineer, a heart surgeon, a writer, Adam Gopnik. You've got lots of people that are triangulating beyond just the tick-tock of biography and the classical interpretations of the meaning of a painting. And I think you're absolutely right. We are so dialectically preoccupied now. I don't have to say anything beyond our politics, but everything is always something or the other thing. And Leonardo did not see this. He saw nature as his greatest teacher. It was perfect. Humans were imperfect. And like Franklin is spending his life not just trying to pursue knowledge of everything, but how to perfect himself, how to be better human being, and to ask the big questions that most of us, distracted by those dialectics, never ask of ourselves. What's the nature of the universe? Who am I? What's my role here? What do I leave? Where do I go? All those sorts of things, Franklin, but Leonardo more than anyone else. I mean, you mentioned Aristotle, and you'd go, yes, this great philosopher and writer and thinker, of which Leonardo is the greatest philosopher and writer and thinker, and also the greatest scientist, which Aristotle was not, in a real sense, a true scientist. It's more observational than experimental.
I should do a Aristotle book, but he's a pretty good scientist.
Yeah, I know, but he's also not a painter,
right?
And he's not the greatest painter of his age. Who's taking You say
Leonardo did the greatest painting of all time,
the most famous painting of all time.
Which one? Last Supper or Mona Lisa?
I would say the Mona Lisa. Okay. In popular culture, it's the one that has, you have to, at least as filmmakers, I'm sure you had as a biographer, we had to scrape away the barnacles of popular culture from her and try to reset to zero and then begin again so that it doesn't become a joke. I mean, even Marcel Duchamp understood that by putting a mustache and a goatee on her. But to get to the point where you understand that this is the apotheosis of the greatest painter's understanding, and that Vasari, who is an early appreciator of Leonardo, is rhapsodizing, as one of our scholars says, about her face and the tonal gradations, the somato technique that allows you cannot find a line or even an edge. You're looking at these tonal gradations, not to mention the hair that you brought up, or the background, the atmospheres, the rocks, all of that sort of the dress. But he's rhapsodizing into the face and then drops down to her neck and says, but I can see the blood flowing in her veins, and I can feel her pulse, and that
blood flowing comes from that river. That
And he
goes from the
understands it
ancient
because
river,
he is
flows right into it.
he's done anatomies. He's dissected human beings. He's had the privilege of dissecting human beings and understood in an old man, is one of his first dissections, that his blood vessels were, as he put it, silted up like the rivers that he has been studying. And he's describing arteriosclerosis, and there's no need for this, right? There's no cardiac surgery. There's no idea that you would ever go into somebody's heart other than to kill them and to take it out. And he eventually, through his questions, decides that he's wrong in inheriting Galen's ideas that they're just 2 chambers. There are 4. He makes a working model of a heart with the valves. And it isn't until we have MRIs 475 years later that we can prove that everything about this useless pursuit of Leonardo's, which must have appeared to people who interpreted these codexes over the years as a kind of cul-de-sac, are in fact true. And so, it's just stunning how modern he is.
You talk about those being cul-de-sacs. I'm going off on history, and there are people, Kenneth Clark, the most famous, who said it's such a shame that he wasted all that time doing scientific studies, because otherwise he could have done more paintings. But when you get to the Mona Lisa, he's dissected every muscle and every nerve in the human face. He's figured out the ones how, from your eyebrow can make you pucker your lower lip and both lips, but you can't pucker your top lip alone. Don't try it. It looks kind of silly. But he also has dissected the human eye to know that light coming in directly to the cornea sees details well, but coming into the corner of your eye sees colors and shadows. So the Mona Lisa's smile, if you can get up close to it in that room,
or see it in a film.
See it, because you do it. You do the close-up with the high res, and you see that the detail of the lips actually turn down slightly, but the shadings turn up a bit, and so it becomes interactive. If you're staring right at her, you don't quite see the smile, but you turn your head slightly, and she smiles at you. And so this is the intersection of the art and science.
I've never wanted... the Mona Lisa is a great work of science, just as those anatomies are great works of art. And I can hear Leonardo's voice saying, "Why are you making the distinction?" as you were saying before. And this is the most important thing, is that when we make a film, people always ask, what do you want people to take away? And we go, nothing. We've worked on Vietnam for 10.5 years. We have our own sets of things. You have yours, and it'll be what it'll be. You like it, you don't like it, you're invested in this as opposed to that. But with this film, his life is such an extraordinary example. If we're using, as the cliche goes, 10% of our brain, he's using 75%. But more than just even wanting to be like Leonardo, awake to the natural world, awake to process, awake to watching things unfold instead of the way we flit, from hummingbirds from one thing to the other, is to not make a joke anymore about that smile. Because as Walter is saying, it is the entire human project engaged in that moment. And that, as Francesca Borgo in our film, a scholar, says, if you can take these inanimate things, the poplar wood that it's painted on, the gesso, the various pigments, and you can imperceptibly know not just how to make this person dimensional, but as he spent his entire life doing, wanting to get the intentions of the mind, what they're feeling and what they're thinking, then you have, if a critic can see the blood flowing, you have created life. You are Dr. Frankenstein. You are, as she said, a painter god. And that makes the Mona Lisa the apotheosis of
You know
this
what
work.
you said earlier, which is very much in this film, is connecting it to the modern, connecting it to people of today. And you're kind of known for what's sometimes called the Ken Burns phenomenon, where you take a still photograph, you pan in, you pan out, you move away. This one has some new technique which is split screen. Explain why y'all did
Well,
that.
no. So first of all, the first technique is I wanted to be a feature filmmaker from 12 years old. I ended up at Hampshire College and became a documentary filmmaker because all of my teachers, Buddy Squires was with me there, were social documentary still photographers. And they reminded me quite correctly that what is and what was is as dramatic as anything the human imagination can make up. So the taking of a photograph is me going back to that feature filmmaker. And so a photograph was a master shot that had within it a wide, a medium, a close, a tilt, a pan, a reveal, an insert of details. So that's what we do. That's what we take apart, and we don't just energetically explore the surface of these two-dimensional plastic things, but we listen to them. Are the troops tramping? Are the guns firing? Is the bat cracking? Whatever it might be. So with Leonardo, though, born like Franklin, and a subject I'm working on now, the American Revolution, before photographs, before newsreels, you're sort of stuck in a way because you got to use paintings and drawings, and after a while they can. But Leonardo gives us permission because of that modernity, because of his sort of prophetic sense of where we would go, his sense in his designs and his inventions of where we could go, his interest in flight, in aerodynamics, all of that sort of stuff. Gave us the permission. His lateral thinking, my daughter calls it, said, "Why can't we show two things in a frame? Why can't we be showing, say, part of Mona Lisa's bodice, but also the texture in a leaf that is resembling the gown? Why can't you show a photograph of what this drawing became, this invention that he had?" And so we were liberated, and sometimes it's 2, and sometimes it's 4, and sometimes it's 9 frames in there. And what you're risking, though, which was for me the hump that I had to get over, which is you're risking the very thing that we do, the sleight of hand that we do, which is to treat a photograph like it's real and dimensional, or a painting like it's real and dimensional. And so suddenly we had to let go of that and say, it's all plastic, it's all two-dimensional, but in his mind, between his ears, that's not telling you what he feels. He's not a diarist. He's not saying, I woke up unhappy today, or I want this, or I want that. He is asking the fundamental questions of life. And if, thankfully, all of the thousands of pages of drawings and philosophies and treatises give us that mind, then that substitutes for the dimension. And fortunately, his paintings also have that kind of sense of not even a still photograph, but of motion picture. I think he invented cinema in a way. I mean,
look at The Last Supper.
The Last Supper is not one moment. It's so many moments that you cannot collect them without acknowledging that it's going on. And so many, as you point out in the film, like The Lady with the Ermine, so many films have narrative dynamics to them. She's looking off screen at the Duke of Milan, who is her new lover, and
then the ermine starts to turn almost.
Ermine looks the same way. So you have movement, and his own studies, and you speak about this too, about drapes. They're all about motion and things. So I think he'd first of all, if we brought him here, he'd be the person least discombobulated by time travel. He'd go, "Oh, you figured that out. You
Especially at the airmail store."
Yeah, you figured you went to the moon. You worked out the gravity thing. But I think he'd be a filmmaker, and he'd put us all out of business.
Right, exactly. When you get to The Last Supper, it's so particularly interesting because you see that moment that starts when Jesus says, "One of you shall betray me," and as you look, as it spreads out, there's a first group that's reacting. Who is it? Me. And then he that dippeth his hand, and the next group, and there's Judas, and you actually see as if it's a sequence.
Exactly. And the cinematic aspects to that and other things. There's a great, as you know, abandoned painting, which is the Adoration of the Magi. It's considered the first experimental piece of art in Western culture, because he's changing it as he's going along, and he abandons it and leaves it alone. But it's still a magnificent painting in and of itself, in that normally in these group things like The Last Supper, everybody looks the same. They've got the same expression, except here he's got a multitude of expressions and different muscular reactions. And you're watching how everybody, maybe the kings, not all the kings are exactly in the same adoring way. Their retinues are are distracted by things or perturbed. No, some people aren't quite sure
Bringing
of
the
this.
gift, the others, it's narrative.
It's so spectacular. And people have been asking, and we've asked ourselves all the way through, and maybe Walter, you can answer it. Like he's the stunning thing is that Leonardo da Vinci, arguably the greatest painter, certainly the painter of the most famous paintings, did less than 20, and less than 10 of them are finished. And so the question, as I look at the Adoration of the Magi, is, does he leave it because the questions that he has asked himself have been satisfied? Does he leave it because he realizes that this will not satisfy the bigger questions that he has? And he even has a figure in the scene in the lower right-hand corner, which is generally agreed upon to be him, a self-portrait. Not the Gandalf bearded wizard of our imagination, but a young, very beautiful young man who's in the lower, looking elsewhere.
Yeah, pointing out.
As if I'm out of here, right?
Yeah.
Just, taxi, like that. And it's a wonderful sort of thing. And I don't know where you fall. I'm sure it's both those things, and neither. That there's some paintings in which I don't need to get any further. I mean, he gets a commission from a well-to-do Florentinian silk merchant to paint his 24-year-old wife, and he never delivers it. And he carries it with him. He dabbles with it for the rest of his life, and it's there when he's finally imported to France by the French king, and it's the reason why the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre.
He does that twice. As a very young man, a Florentine silk merchant gives him a commission to paint a portrait of his wife, and it becomes Ginevra da Vinci.
Right.
And it's in three-quarter profile. It has a river coming down from the eons of time into her, and yet it's not the Mona Lisa. And if you have to answer the Kenneth Clark question of did he have to do all these other things, if you see the difference between Ginevra da Vinci, which is in the National Gallery in Washington,
we have it.
the only one,
the only Leonardo this side of the Atlantic.
And then you see the one he does at the end, which is the Mona Lisa. But yes, he doesn't finish a lot of paintings. He's got the Mona Lisa. He's supposed to deliver it, but as you say, he keeps it, 12 years or so? 15. Going from place to place, finally taking it to France, layer after layer, a very, very thin glaze. It's almost all oil with just the tiniest bit of pigments, maybe 70 layers just to do the lips. So I think part of it is whenever he got a new pen, and you see it in his notebooks, he'll say, is anything ever done?
Yeah.
Is anything ever accomplished?
D me.
Yeah. And I don't think he cared that much about the finishing.
I don't think so.
He cared about the process.
The process, that's exactly it.
I mean, you say this in your doc.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting thing because the reaction is, there is a moment when he's working on something and it's taking longer than he thought, and the commissioner is the Duke of Milan, who is a ruthless dictator. And when the Duke of Milan says, I need the Last Supper finished, he finishes it. But that may have been for other...
It does help to have a demanding patron.
Exactly. And the exigencies of that pressure are pretty real at that point.
Wait, do you remember the little thing where before the Duke gets involved, and Leonardo's going there and he'll spend an hour on the scaffolding and not even put a brush
nothing
stroke
there, right.
and saying, it's just intuitive. And then the head of the abbey, finally says, you've got to do it. And he says, I'm looking for the person who will be the model for Judas. And if you keep pushing me, you're going to be Judas.
Yes.
But then the Duke comes along and he finishes the damn thing.
So I was in Rome a few weeks ago. Was the Rome Film Festival showed the first episode a couple times during their festival, and the U.S. Embassy sort of hosted a party for us. And I met a guy who pulled me over at the end of the evening and in very broken English told me that his ancestor is the model for not only Jesus Christ in the Last Supper, because there's a notation of him as he was outside of Milan and felt it should be some other face, but also for one of Michelangelo's statues.
Wow.
And we ended up seeing the statue, and they look very, very similar to whatever. And
Yeah, that's actually more believable than most people who tell me,
They're
those type of
Leonardo's.
things. Because we do have his notebooks, and he is doing the sketches of each person who's going to be in the Last Supper.
I think the important thing to say, as you said before, is that these thousands and thousands of pages, these various codexes which are around the world, and very fragile, and all written in a backwards mirror script. He was a lefty, as I was, and if you're a lefty, you smudged your paper in school, and he just figured he's not going to do that. And so if you can imagine a kind of degree of intentionality in every moment of your life, that even if you're writing down milk, eggs, cheese, for the grocery store list, which he has a few, or your mother's burial expenses, it's all written backwards. And it takes a phenomenal amount of concentration and will to be able to do that. But he's not saying how he feels. We know some things about him. He's born out of wedlock, which may be the great saving grace. He is not permitted as a result of that to share the family names, and so he's given the name of a patron saint in that area of Vinci. Leonardo is the patron saint of freedom, which is a wonderful thing. He's free, but he's also not permitted to go to university, and so he is not going to be a notary as his father was, thank goodness, but he's also going to not have to be enthralled by the discipline of any particular
He says
science.
that I've never had to be the disciple of received wisdom. I
Right.
was always the disciple of experiments and experience.
Exactly.
Actually, it's one word. It's hard to know how to translate
He
experience.
he says, and our first episode is called The Disciple of Experience, because he is looking at the world. He is not accepting the received wisdom of the now reintroduced classics. He's going, and then he's trying to prove it. He's thinking of more things. He has no microscope. He has no telescope. And all with this eye, he is understanding things about gravity and about the dynamics of flight, about water dynamics, about all sorts of things. And he's drawing fantastical drawings and machines, and they're spectacularly beautiful in every way. But we don't know that much about him. We hear other people say how funny he was. He's not the tortured Michelangelo. He is funny. He plays an instrument. He invents an instrument. He is a good singer. He's great company. He dresses flamboyantly and colorfully. He's the person you want to bring to that dinner, even when he's alive, to be popular. And so it's a wonderful mystery for us. I know you must have had it, that you finally just have to resort to the extraordinary curiosity, this engine of relentless questioning of everything. And Guillermo del Toro says at the beginning of the film, his great gift was he felt that the universe demanded that he interrogate it and ask of it everything that you could possibly know about it.
And what you get out of that is one of the greatest gifts of civilization.
Yes.
He really is the forerunner of the scientific method. I mean, he's the one who says, okay, the Bible talks about the flood. Let's look at the fossils in each layer of rock. And he's doing it partly because he's doing Virgin of the Rocks, but he's become... And that notion of question everything. And experiment.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. The Vitruvian Man, it was this idea, there's many religious disciplines that have the equivalent of as above, so below. And Leonardo is fascinated with the microcosm and the macrocosm. Well, while he doesn't have a microscope and doesn't have a telescope, so he can't say what we can, the understanding that the atom shares a significant and profound similar architecture to the solar system, right? He gets that in other ways. And so the Vitruvian Man is supposed to be a human being whose proportions have reached a degree of perfection that resemble the most beautifully designed temple, which in and of itself has to be subservient to the perfection of nature in some way. So it's all levels of proportion. And his Vitruvian Man is so far beyond Vitruvius's man.
It's also a self-portrait,
Yes.
which people are, that's him standing there, surrounded by the cosmos, surrounded by the spirituality. It's just amazing. By the way, we only have a few more, and I know anybody who's a friend of Alessandro and Graydon's, they want to hear themselves ask questions. So, do you mind if I open it up?
No, please. I didn't realize.
Yeah,
we'd
right.
react.
Otherwise, we won't get. All right.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, because I said yes.
Peter.
Just a question. I mean, my impression of Leonardo and everything you were saying tonight is, he's creative, he's optimistic, he's looking forward, he's a disciple of experience. And yet in your film, you talk about how when he ages, he starts worrying about the world and the world coming to an end. Other than just old age, what brought that fear about? What do you think led him to have that concern?
That's a great question, Peter.
He's haunted by demons from childhood, born out of wedlock, not legitimated by his dad. And he's always doing these deluge drawings. And when, in the end, he's haunted by it, that's when he does these storms. That apocalyptic or whatever. And so even though he is the most genial and jovial and has his posse and is always having great dinners, has Salai, his rascally boyfriend, everything else, you see in him this great depressions and great clouds that come over him. And even though obviously Ken is right that we don't know him fully personally, he's not writing St. Augustine's Confessions, he's doing notebooks, we can see
in his work
the turmoil that existed in his soul, which is why he's an artist.
It's important. He's not a tortured artist, but he's asking these big questions, and at times those questions get dark. The thing that always surprised me was that even from the earliest, he sees death as an evil. Now, this is this great disciple of nature who ought to look at the cycles of nature and understand that everything, including the world, which is what those apocalyptic things are, susceptible to a cycle of life and death and perhaps rebirth. And so he gets it, and I'm surprised by the way in which it's a dark cloud, that he would describe it in terms of the greatest evil was death. Mm-hmm. And so one imagines that in your question is there too, that as he approaches old age, those visions overtake, those visions make it even more difficult to have the more Leonardo-esque sanguine view, optimistic view of everything.
Yeah, the pointing away. Yes.
Well, it seems to set you back a little bit. If he felt that way, how are we supposed to feel?
So I just hate to break it to you, but none of us are getting out of here alive, right? And we could understandably just remain in the fetal position, I suppose, but we don't, right? We raise children, we write books, we symphonies, we tend gardens, and so all of those are to keep. Wynton Marsalis said in jazz, it's all to keep the wolf from the door. And the wolf from the door is that not just intimation, but that just onrush of understanding that we're not getting out of this alive.
It's the end papers of the book I did, not to try to, begins with the fetus in the womb. Yeah. That's in Windsor. It's just curled up. And it ends, the last end paper, is the very old Leonardo looking scared into the swirls and drawings of him contemplating. And the paintings he does at the very end, St. John pointing, all of them have the pointing finger.
All the pointing finger.
Where are we going to go? Yes?
Ken, I've heard you speak with Marsalis. I've heard you talk with Wynton about how you arrive at how you make a film and sort of lay it on top of Wynton's beautiful score and soundtrack. How did you arrive at the music in this film?
So this is actually, I would not call what Wynton's done for us a score. He's produced themes for us, which we've been able to use, most notably in our film The War, about the Second World War. And so he did themes for the 4 towns that we were telling the entire story of the greatest cataclysm in human history through the kind of bottom-up to top-down view. And music is central to every film that we've ever done. This is the first film that's actually is a composed score. And among the many temp and needle drops that we had in the film were pieces by a young composer, fantastic, named Caroline Shaw, who shares the kind of joyousness that Leonardo also has. And it's just she's wonderful. And we went to her and said, my son-in-law, David McMahon, said, I want to throw everybody else out and use her. And she said yes. And what she did she works with a vocal group, 3 groups. One is a vocal group of which she participates called Roomful of Teeth. And she works with another percussive group called SO, S-O, with an umlaut over the O, percussion. And they will have traditional, percussive instruments, but they also fill up pieces of kitchen pottery with water to get a certain tone. And then she works with a string quartet called the Ataka Quartet. And she's worked with them in the studio before. We brought them out a couple weeks ago to Town Hall. They'd never performed in public before, and we sort of, as Winton would say, traded choruses with them, allowing a clip from the film, and then they'd play a couple pieces, a clip from the film, and it was just mesmerizing to see them do that. The difference between a score, which is a mathematical term, is that we have traditionally just edited our picture to our existing music. Before we start editing, we've got that music in hand, and we may just lengthen a sentence to fit a phrase of music, or cut a sentence back to fit a phrase of music. In feature films, I'm looking at Michael. In feature films, you score it. You've got it. You lock the picture, and then John Williams is coming in, and he's making sure that hit happens exactly at that frame count, right? How many feet and how many frames. And so Caroline was closer to that. She was working to picture. And we'd never done that before. We never record our narration to picture. We never do anything to picture. First-person voices, we always look for meaning first. And so just as we surrendered a certain sleight of hand with the visuals that I was talking about, so we surrendered quite magnificently to Caroline's joy, who like a cloud lifts Leonardo even farther into the heavens.
Ken Burns said that if Leonardo came back now, he would be a documentary filmmaker. He ain't coming back, so we have Ken Burns instead. Thank you, Ken.